I get a lot of cases of neglect these days. Paramedics and police are much more aware of how forensic entomology can be used. And so where you get those kind of conditions, you tend to get a lot of flies. And so it's just, one simple step between the flies feeding on things like feces and food and then feeding on a live body.
What is a forensic entomologist and what does your job entail?
Well, an entomologist is somebody that studies insects, and forensic means within a legal context. So it's any time that insects or quite often other arthropods are involved in cases. The types of cases normally are things like depositions in woodland, for instance, and then also where bodies are found in properties. So quite often where a body hasn't been discovered for quite some time. There have been some that I've done where the bodies have literally been by a roadside. You're working literally right by a main road with all these cars rushing past who are, completely unaware that there's a deceased body right there. So yeah, you do work on some odd cases, yeah. And sometimes you just wonder, like, how did this actually come to be? How did this person get into this particular position? Or, but that's really up to the police to work out.
What can insects tell us about a crime scene?
Well, the principle of forensic entomology and the most common use of it is in determining minimum time since death. So what that means is basically when the first insects have colonised the body. So a lot of people say that forensic entomologists estimate time since death. And actually we don't do that, because if I can go to a scene and I can say this person died at 5 p.m. on Friday, that makes me a really good suspect. Because there's inevitably going to be a delay before insects find the body and they start colonising the body. So what I'm doing is I'm determining when the first insects colonise the body. And in most cases, those are going to be blowflies, so blue bottles and green bottles.
And what other types of insects can you find on a dead body? So
as a body decomposes, it sort of changes physically and it gives off different odours as well. And so we have what we call the succession of insects. So you get different types of insects that come in and feed on the body as it decomposes. Generally, it's the blowflies are the first ones, things like flesh flies, house flies. There's all sorts of other types of flies that tend to come in at the later stages of decomposition. So when the body is already somewhat decomposed, things like cheese skippers you get. The later stages, you get lots of different types of beetles. So things like domestes beetles that like the body when it's dry and chewy. They don't like it when it's fresh. I can use some of those insects to help determine how long that person may have been deceased, but it's much less reliable than the blowflies. So the blowflies really are the most important insects because you can get quite an accurate indication of when a body was first colonised using blowflies. The female blowfly will be attracted to a body by the odour that's giving off. She will lay eggs on the body and those will then hatch out into larvae or maggots. And that's the main feeding stage. So they will go through 3 separate, what we call instar or stages, first, second and third, and they molt between those stages and that enables them to feed and to grow. So they start off, the eggs are very small, they're obviously not moving. It takes approximately 24 hours for them to hatch out into larvae. And then the larvae will be feeding on the body. So quite often that's the first thing that people will notice is when you've actively, you've got larvae actively feeding on the body.
Is there any particular place where you're more likely to find insects? Does that help tell you anything about a potential crime or a potential crime scene?
You tend to find them in the same places. So where you've got a body, quite often the face is exposed, the head is exposed. If you imagine if you've got a body outdoors, if the body may be clothed, but quite often the face will be exposed. And there's lots of nice kind of hiding places for eggs to be laid and for larvae to feed. So there are sort of obvious places to look for the insects. in the kind of underneath the body as well. Obviously, if you've got decomposition fluids, then you're going to get blowflies laying eggs in sort of folds of the skin and underneath the body, etc. I mean, sometimes the lack of insects can actually be really useful as well. So if you would expect to have found insects on a body, so for instance, if a body's found outside and you would expect to find insects, if there aren't any insects associated with it, then that could suggest that the body was perhaps stored somewhere prior to being deposited outside. So I think the first case I worked on actually involved fleas. At the time I was writing the Handbook of British Fleas at the Natural History Museum. I just started my PhD in Forensic Entomology, but at the time I was one of the resident experts on fleas at the museum. There's so many things about fleas that are just amazing. They're just perfectly designed for their parasitic lifestyle, and there's so many different types as well. I think I recognised 63 species living in Britain. The police basically suspected that somebody had been killed in a property. It was actually a holiday home, because a carpet had been thrown out, and the owners of the house said that the reason it had been thrown out was because they had a very heavy infestation of fleas. So I had the really bright idea of seeing if they had a vacuum cleaner at the property. And this was back in the days when when vacuum cleaners had bags. And so I said, send me the vacuum cleaner bag and I'll go through it and I'll see if I can find any evidence of fleas. But they had 3 dogs. So, one would expect, to have some fleas possibly. And so, I mean, that's probably one of the worst jobs I've done, actually, is going through somebody else's vacuum cleaner bag. It's pretty horrible. I did find some evidence of fleas. I then got asked to go to the permanent residence of the couple and to search there as well for evidence of fleas, which I did. And again, I found some evidence of them, but nothing, not a huge number at all. So I just went back to the police, sent them a report, and in which I said, I haven't found evidence of a heavy infestation of fleas. So they then questioned the couple again, and that's the point where they said actually their son had killed somebody on the carpet. It was covered in blood, and that's why they'd thrown the carpet out. So it was a really, really simple case where just finding the right expert makes such a difference, finding somebody that kind of knows something about that particular organism that's involved in that particular case. One of the very first cases I worked on was the case of Shafili Ahmed, who was a Pakistani girl, and she had disappeared from home. She'd gone missing previously, and her parents had been obviously trying to find her. She'd run away from home. She was found. She came back again. The next time she went missing, she was actually reported missing by school teachers, and it was her friends at school who noticed that, she hadn't been coming into school. So there was a suspicion that, potentially the family may or may not be involved. Her body was found 6 months later after she disappeared. And it was actually another 6 years or so before the case was finally concluded, because it did turn out that her family were involved in her disappearance and in her death. But at the time that her body was found, the police didn't really have any firm evidence. They might have suspicions, but you need to have evidence in order for a case to go to court. So I worked on that case. I determined that she had died soon after she'd gone missing. So she'd been missing for 6 months. Her body was found by a river, very heavily decomposed, and I found insect evidence associated with it. And so I didn't attend the criminal court case, but I did attend the coroner's court. And the coroner basically determined that it was an unnatural death, and that therefore the police should continue to investigate it. I think the cases that get to me the most is when a death occurs due to family members or spouses, or you know, when it's somebody who should actually be looking after that person. It should be, you know, when you've got young people or vulnerable people, for instance, who should be able to feel safe within their own environment, within their family home. And when the people that should be looking after them are actually the cause of their death, that's obviously, you know, incredibly upsetting to everybody concerned, everybody that works on the case, and obviously the extended family and friends as well. So, I mean, it's great with a case like that if you feel that you have contributed in some way to actually resolving that case and getting justice for that person. It doesn't bring them back. So, you know, it's obviously still very upsetting to work on those sorts of cases. But yeah, it's good when you feel that you've actually contributed. I get a lot of cases of neglect these days. I think that's partly because paramedics and police are much more aware of how forensic entomology can be used in cases of neglect. So people don't always die. You know, in the best case scenarios, it's picked up before the person actually dies. So this is basically cases of meiosis, when a living person or animal is colonized by insects. And so this tends to happen to people who are very vulnerable. So it could be very young people. So for instance, children or infants in nappies still. It can be disabled people who may be bedbound. It can be very elderly people who are also very bedbound. And they tend to be very dependent on the people who are caring for them. And unfortunately, what happens is sometimes the people who are caring for them can't cope. And so they basically neglect to look after these people. And so they're basically bedbound. They get lesions, bed sores, ulcers, those kinds of things. And those can very quickly become colonized by insects. So one of the cases that really stands out for me was a case of Kaylee Tipford, who was a young girl who was disabled. I believe she'd had spina bifida since birth. She'd been in a wheelchair all her life. And she actually was a very active teenager. She went to school, she played basketball, wheelchair basketball. She was a very happy child. And then the pandemic hit and kids got sent home. And basically she became bedbound. She became very obese because her parents were just feeding her junk food. She wasn't getting any kind of exercise at all. By the time she died, she wouldn't have been able to fit into her wheelchair, even if she'd wanted to, because it was a child's wheelchair. She died, I think it was either just before or I think it was just after her 16th birthday. And at that point, she was completely bedbound and unfortunately living in very, very unsanitary conditions. And so where you get those kind of conditions, you tend to get a lot of flies. And so it's just, you know, one simple step between the flies feeding on things like feces and food and then feeding on a live body and ulcers and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, as I say, it wasn't caught early enough. She died, the paramedics were called. And immediately, with cases like that, the paramedics immediately realised there's something very, very wrong because the person is colonised by insects in certain parts of their body. And so then obviously the police get involved. And so that was a case, both parents were jailed for neglect. But what I had to do with that was to demonstrate that the larvae that were present at the scene were actively feeding on her while she was alive. It's not enough just to say, well, they're feeding on the detritus, they're feeding on the food, they're feeding on feces and things like that. Seeing images of the scene, there were a lot of fly papers hanging up. That's something that's very common, that when a house has a very heavy infestation of flies, usually house flies, rather than actually dealing with the problem of the flies, which is caused by food and detritus and things. Instead, they'll just hang up loads of fly papers. That's actually really good evidence, because that demonstrates they've got a very heavy, colonisation of a very heavy population of flies within the property. There was a lot of fly speck, so that's basically fly vomit and feces that you see when you've got a very heavy infestation of flies. You'll get it on the windowsills, on the ceilings, on the kitchen cabinets, etc. And again, you can see that from the images. And yeah, she'd just had her 16th birthday, and so there were, in the background of the photographs, you could see loads and loads of birthday cards, 16th birthday cards. So there were clearly lots and lots of people that cared about her, and an unopened birthday cake as well that she obviously hadn't been well enough to eat. And it's when you see things like that at a scene that it really brings it home to you that she was just a very normal 16-year-old girl, who should have been living the best years of her life. And it was cut short. And it was so avoidable. It's tragic. Yeah.
And Amoret, how do you, as a person, sort of deal with those emotional scenes and seeing that tragedy that, as you say, could have so easily been avoided? What's it like for you to have to kind of continue working during those difficult moments?
It is difficult. I mean, weirdly, I almost find it easier when I go to the scene and I'm kind of right there and I'm doing the collecting myself. What I find more difficult is in cases like the Kaylee Titford case, where I'm just sent photographs, and that means that I'm at home, I'm sitting in my own office at home, and I'm looking at these images on my computer, and so it's really kind of literally bringing it home. And although you're sort of distanced from it because you're just looking at images, it almost makes it more difficult because you feel like you have no control over it, because it's all there, it's all happened, and you're almost like a third party looking in. When you're there at the scene, you just focus on the evidence and what has to be done, and you feel like you're a little bit more in control because you're actually physically doing something to help, because you're actually collecting the evidence and preserving it. I've learned now to make sure that I don't work on cases at night, like last thing at night, because I have all these images swirling around in my head when I go to bed. So I make sure that I work on cases like this, and then I have some downtime, which might be, then watching TV or going for a walk or doing some other work or whatever it is. You have to sort of give yourself the time to kind of clear your head of what you've been reading and what you've been looking at.
How do you feel when you're preparing to go to a crime scene? Do you have a process that you sort of go through in order to prepare yourself for what you might see?
Not really, no. Every case is different, and I used to perhaps ask a bit more because I'd kind of want to be able to be prepared for it. But actually, it's never the same as seeing it for yourself. And also, it can be quite difficult to describe scenes as well. So sometimes you might get, a police officer saying, oh, it's a very decomposed body and it's a horrible scene. And then I'll walk in there and I'll kind of think, well, it's not nearly as bad as some of the ones I've been to. So actually, what I tend to be more interested in, is it indoors? Is it outdoors? Is the body still in situ? Is there any, are the insects evident? And just get a few details like that.
And what is the most memorable crime scene that you've been to?
They're all memorable in different ways. One case where a son had killed both his parents and he'd hidden their bodies around the back of the house. I mean, that kind of stands out because that's something that thankfully doesn't happen every day.
And Amoret, how long have you been working as a forensic entomologist?
I think it's It's definitely over 20 years. So yeah, early 2000s.
What case or what moment of your career are you most proud of?
I think just getting to this point, you know, I think if somebody had asked me 30 years ago, what are you going to be doing in 30 years? Never in a million years would I have said that I'm doing this. And there's very few of us in the UK, very, very few. And so it feels quite a privilege in a way to be working in a job that so few people do, because it is quite unique. You know, and I think just incredibly useful to society to be able to do a job like this.
How does the work that you do, Amoret, impact the way that you see the world, and I suppose your view on humanity and death?
I like to think I remain positive about people in general. I don't tend to meet people and kind of think, you know, they could, you know, they're going to be responsible for the next crime scene I go to. Luckily, it's a rarity, these types of, you know, horrendous crimes that you see. But generally, I do try and separate it from, you know, my actual life, my own life. I don't want my own life to be, you know, colonised by, you know, images of crime scenes and thoughts of death and stuff. I did a lot of my PhD work in Tennessee at the Anthropological Research Facility, colloquially called the Body Farm. And one of the things that a lot of people ask me is, are you going to donate your body to a body farm? Of which I'm undecided at the moment. I think, having seen a lot of decomposing bodies, I definitely don't want to be buried, because actually burial extends the decomposition time, and I don't want to be hanging around for a long time in the soil. So I think my choice is definitely cremation, probably, so I don't have to go through the decomposition process.
If there's a murder, I need to be there before they touch the corpse, because or approach it too much, because a little bent twig or a footprint in the grass or disturbed leaves all means something to me. And then I come to the body and I look at the body, but I want to know what's underneath the body, what's around the body. And so, I mean, if it's a burial, I have to look at all the soil in the burial and be there with the archaeologist when they excavate it, so that, because a lot of evidence comes out.